Nobody in the grand hall could believe what they were seeing. The whispers spread like lightning, bouncing off the marble walls, sweeping through the crowd until every head had turned. The man who thought this night belonged to him suddenly froze. His hand trembled around his glass. His lips stiffened into a half-smile that no longer worked. And the woman at his side, his secretary, felt her confidence drain away as the entire ballroom shifted its gaze elsewhere, because the thunder of applause wasn't for him. It roared instead for the very woman he had tried to erase from his life. That was the night Daniel Cross, the billionaire whose empire was worth $65 billion, discovered that pride can turn to ash in seconds, and standing at the center of his collapse was the wife he had hidden, denied, and betrayed. The gala that evening wasn't just a social event. It was the highlight of the season, an annual gathering hosted in the most luxurious hotel of the capital. Glittering chandeliers bathed the guests in gold, the string orchestra played softly in the background, and the finest families of the city paraded through the doors in gowns and tuxedos. Power was in the air, ambition clung to every smile, and reputations were being measured with every handshake. And Daniel thrived in this environment. Tall, sharply dressed, his silver cufflinks shining as bright as his grin, he strode into the gala with his secretary Melissa, clinging to his arm. She was younger, stylish, and chosen carefully to complement his vanity. To Daniel, appearances were everything. He loved the cameras, the whispers, the admiration that followed him everywhere. But the truth was darker. At home, there was a woman who had chosen to step away from the spotlight. A woman he no longer introduced with pride. Her name was Grace. She was his wife, but you wouldn't have known it from the way Daniel acted. He kept her at the edges of his world, out of sight, as though her presence might somehow dull his shine. Grace was quiet, thoughtful, and dignified, a stark contrast to Daniel's relentless hunger for recognition. That night, as Daniel paraded Melissa into the ballroom, he didn't so much as glance toward the woman who had built her life beside his. To him, Grace was invisible, but invisibility has power. The air itself seemed heavy with anticipation, though Daniel was too drunk on his own arrogance to sense it. While he laughed with the elites, while he boasted about deals and flaunted Melissa's beauty like a trophy, murmurs began threading through the room, small at first, then growing stronger, slipping from one guest to another like sparks waiting for flame. Daniel clinked his glass to toast himself, unaware that his downfall was already in motion. And when the host of the evening took the stage, smiling broadly as the orchestra silenced, a hush fell over the hall. Daniel leaned back, certain that the next round of applause would be his. He had no idea that the announcement about to be made would unravel his pride and rewrite the story of who truly held the power. The host's voice carried with authority, echoing through the golden chamber. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we gather not only to celebrate success but to honor generosity, and this year's honoree is someone whose quiet strength has transformed lives. A ripple of intrigue moved across the room. People leaned forward. Daniel straightened in his chair, tugging at his cufflinks, convinced his name was about to be announced. He let a smirk spread across his face, already picturing the headlines. But something was off. The applause that followed wasn't tentative. It was thunderous, heartfelt, overwhelming. And yet no one was looking at him. Not a single eye turned in Daniel's direction. Whispers hissed like fire through the crowd. Melissa, still clutching his arm, faltered. Her painted smile wavered. Her hand slipped, and Daniel's certainty began to crack. The name that filled the room was not his. Please welcome. Grace Cross, gasps erupted. For a moment Daniel thought he had misheard. His wife, the very woman he had dismissed, belittled, and kept hidden, was now the center of adoration? Impossible. Yet there she was, rising from her seat at the back of the hall, walking toward the stage with calm grace and quiet dignity. Daniel's jaw clenched. His glass nearly slipped from his hand. Melissa shrank beside him, shrinking under the weight of hundreds of eyes, realizing instantly that her role as his companion tonight had become an embarrassment, not an honor. Grace's presence was magnetic. She wore no glittering crown. No entourage surrounded her. Yet the room seemed to bend toward her. Each step she took drew admiration that Daniel had always craved but never truly earned. Dressed in deep emerald silk, her posture steady, her smile serene, She walked with the kind of elegance money couldn't buy, and then the truth began to spill from the lips of the host. This institution has thrived for years because of a woman who chose to give quietly. Without demanding the spotlight, she has lifted families out of despair, funded schools where there was none, and restored dignity to communities that had been forgotten. Eyes widened. Guests who once bowed to Daniel's empire now whispered Grace's name with awe. The applause returned louder than before, and this time Daniel felt it like a slap. He looked around, desperate for control. But everywhere he turned, people were no longer looking at him with respect. They were looking with amusement, even pity. Melissa let her arm drop from his. The cameras swung away. Every lens, every gaze, every cheer belonged to Grace. Daniel, the man who had spent his life convincing the world of his importance, now sat motionless, a spectator in his own downfall. And as Grace stepped up to the podium, her eyes didn't seek him out. But the weight of her presence pressed on him heavier than iron. Her lips parted to speak, and the hall fell into silence so complete it felt like the world had stopped turning. Grace placed her hands gently on the podium, her posture tall but unassuming. The golden light caught her face, and in that instant, the ballroom felt different, warmer, brighter, alive. Her first words were soft, but they carried with an authority that silenced every whisper. "No child," she began, "should ever feel forgotten. No community should ever be left behind simply because the world stopped paying attention." A stillness gripped the room. Every sentence was measured, deliberate, and filled with the weight of truth. Grace didn't need to shout. Her calmness was power. Daniel's throat tightened. He knew those words, not because he had spoken them, but because he had once heard them in their home. Late at night, when Grace sat at her desk planning donations, writing letters, organizing relief quietly while he brushed her efforts aside, he had mocked her for not chasing the spotlight. He had called her work small compared to his billion-dollar deals. Now those same words were echoing through the hall, and the world was listening. Grace's voice grew steadier, richer. This foundation exists not because wealth demands recognition, but because love demands action. We build schools not for applause, but so children can dream. We fund shelters not for prestige, but because families deserve dignity. And when people choose to act with compassion, they discover a truth far greater than wealth, that true influence is measured in lives changed, not headlines won. Thunderous applause shook the chandeliers, louder this time, rolling through the crowd like a storm. People rose to their feet, clapping, cheering, wiping their eyes. Grace stood there composed, while Daniel felt as if the floor had vanished beneath him. Melissa edged away, her head lowered, desperate to escape the humiliation of being seen as nothing more than a prop in Daniel's failed performance. She knew she had no place in this story anymore. Quietly, she slipped toward the back of the hall, unnoticed and unwanted. Cameras flashed. Reporters scribbled notes. Influential leaders nodded with admiration. Some glanced toward Daniel, their eyes sharp with judgment. He, the mighty billionaire who had strutted into the gala expecting worship, now looked pale, rigid, almost hollow. Grace hadn't mentioned his name once. Yet every sentence felt like a blade cutting through his arrogance. She didn't need to expose him directly. The contrast between her dignity and his vanity exposed him more than any accusation ever could, and Daniel felt it. The empire he had built, his sprawling business, his carefully curated image, the pride he wore like armor, suddenly seemed paper-thin. It all cracked under the weight of a truth he could no longer deny. The world admired Grace, not him. She had become the heartbeat of the evening, the center of every gaze, the very symbol of integrity. And as she paused, letting the cheers subside, she looked out over the sea of faces. For the briefest second, her eyes found Daniel, not with anger, not with cruelty, but with a calm certainty that told him his reign of arrogance had ended. The silence that followed was heavier than any applause. Everyone waited to hear what she would say next, and Daniel knew whatever came would only drive the final nail into his pride. Grace let the silence linger, her steady gaze sweeping across the hall. The air was thick, charged, as though every soul in the room had instinctively leaned closer to catch her next words. She finally spoke again, her voice unwavering. Too often power is mistaken for arrogance. Too often wealth is mistaken for worth. But true strength is not found in how loudly you boast, but in how deeply you care. Tonight I stand here not as someone who wanted recognition, but as someone who believes that dignity belongs to everyone, no matter their race, their background, or their circumstance. A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience. Hands clapped, voices cheered. Some guests even stood again, their applause rolling through the hall like waves. Grace didn't bask in it. She only nodded once, acknowledging them, then continued. Compassion, she said, does not seek the spotlight. It does not parade itself. It works quietly, even when ignored, even when dismissed. But make no mistake, compassion is the most powerful force we have, and it will always, always outlast pride. Daniel flinched. It was as if every syllable had been aimed directly at him. The crowd didn't need her to call him out by name. The truth had already branded him. Whispers spread like wildfire. She was his wife? All this time? He came here flaunting another woman while she built this foundation behind the scenes. Every nod of respect that once belonged to him now turned toward Grace. Every smile that once flattered him now curved with pity or disdain. He could feel the weight of 100 unspoken judgments pressing against his chest, suffocating him. Melissa was gone. He realized it only when he turned in panic, hoping for her presence to anchor him, but she had vanished into the sea of guests, swallowed by the very anonymity she had hoped to escape. The cameras swiveled back toward Grace, capturing her poise, her serenity, her words that were already being etched into the memory of everyone present. Daniel, once the man every lens adored, sat in the shadow of his own shame. Grace spoke once more, her final words cutting through the hall like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. This is not about me. It has never been about me. It is about those children who deserve classrooms, about families who deserve shelter, about voices that deserve to be heard. That is why we give. That is why we must never forget the invisible, because sometimes the invisible carry the greatest strength of all. The applause was deafening. Guests stood shoulder to shoulder cheering, some with tears on their cheeks. Leaders rushed to the front rows, clapping harder, nodding, their admiration openly declared. Grace stepped back from the podium, and in that instant, she wasn't just a guest of honor, she was a symbol. Daniel couldn't bear it. He felt exposed, stripped of the armor of pride he had spent decades polishing. The empire he wielded suddenly felt hollow. The billions in his account seemed powerless against the tide of respect that now belonged to his wife. And in that vast ballroom, with cameras flashing and applause echoing, Daniel Cross, the man who thought he owned the night, sat alone in his humiliation, but this was not the end, because what happened after the applause would seal his legacy, forever. The ovation still thundered long after. Grace had stepped away from the podium. Her words echoed in the air, weaving themselves into the memory of every guest present. People didn't just see her, they felt her. They felt her strength, her conviction, and the quiet fire she carried that no arrogance could extinguish. Daniel remained seated, rigid, his knuckles white against the stem of his glass. He wanted to stand, to reclaim attention, to remind them who he was, but he couldn't. Every attempt to move was met with the weight of hundreds of eyes. Not the eyes of admiration he once commanded, but eyes heavy with judgment, disbelief, and ridicule. His mind raced. How could this happen? How could she, Grace, steal the night from me? But deep down he knew the truth. She hadn't stolen anything. She had only revealed what had been true all along. That while he craved applause, she had quietly built something enduring. The whispers grew louder now, and this time they weren't in his favor. Did you hear? She's been funding this charity for years, and he never once gave her credit. To walk in with another woman on her night, disgraceful. Every murmur was another dagger. Daniel's carefully constructed image unraveled in real time, not with scandal, not with financial ruin, but with something far worse, exposure of his emptiness. Grace, meanwhile, returned to her seat with composure. Guests rushed to greet her, shake her hand, and thank her. They circled around her like she was the true star of the evening. And she was. Melissa was gone, forgotten before the night was even over. Her designer gown, her painted smile, her presence, it all dissolved into irrelevance. No one mentioned her name again, but Grace's name? It was etched into history that night. Daniel sat alone, a man still wealthy, still powerful on paper, but stripped of the one thing he had always craved more than money: respect. He realized too late that admiration cannot be forced and pride cannot buy loyalty. The gala ended with Grace standing as the symbol of hope, compassion, and integrity. Her story spread beyond the ballroom, carried into headlines and whispered in boardrooms. She became the example people pointed to when they spoke of quiet power. And Daniel? He left the hall not to applause but to silence, to whispers that chased him into the night, to reputations that no longer bent in his favor. His downfall was not measured in dollars lost. It was measured in dignity stripped away, because true power does not come from arrogance. It comes from compassion. It comes from integrity. And Grace proved that night that the invisible can rise higher than anyone dares to imagine. The empire Daniel had flaunted might survive, but his pride, his legacy, that had been shattered forever. And long after the lights dimmed and the music faded, one truth remained clear. Power built on ego crumbles, but power rooted in compassion endures.